Hello there, my name is Helen McGrath and I'm the statistician working on the Sexual Violence Survey. And in this presentation today, I'm just going to give you some of the key points from the latest publication from that survey. That publication, the Sexual Violence Survey 2022 Disclosure of Experiences, focuses on those who have had experiences of sexual violence, either as an adult or as a child. And just to be aware that when we talk about disclosure, what we mean here is whether you've told one person, many people, or a group or organisation. So the data in this publication is broken down by whether someone had experienced sexual violence as an adult or as a child, and includes additional information on who you told, how long it took you to disclose to someone, the reasons why you disclosed or did not disclose, whether you used any services or whether you disclosed your experience to the police. So this is a very complex and challenging survey, and involved the collection of some very personal and sensitive information from respondents. And the CSO would like to thank all of the respondents who engaged with the survey and for sharing their experience with the CSO. So the starting point for this project was a report of the Scoping Group on Sexual Violence Data, which was published in 2018. And they recommended that a comprehensive national survey on the prevalence of sexual violence should be undertaken. It's been 20 years since Ireland has had prevalence data on this area, and there's a strong societal and policy interest in knowing more about the prevalence levels of sexual violence in Ireland. This publication is part of our official statistics and is embedded in our work plan for a repeat in 10 years' time. So just to outline some key observations on the collection of this type of data. Surveys on sexual violence only are few. Normally, data on sexual violence is collected through other instruments like a crime survey or a general health survey. And just to be aware of that when you're looking at our data compared to other countries' data collection events on sexual violence. This is clearly a very sensitive topic, and the underreporting risk has to be managed throughout the survey. You must be very careful in how you ask questions on a sensitive topic that you don't affect the prevalence levels. And you can see a lot of information we've provided within our background notes as to how we've tried to reduce that underreporting risk. Research shows us that society's awareness of violence can impact on the reported or disclosed levels of violence in society. And it would be very natural to want to compare our data to other countries' data on sexual violence levels of experience. But we would caution against that due to the differences in methodology in terms of the collection of this and comparing it to other countries as well. The CSO appreciates the data in this publication today covers a range of individual stories which speak to the lived experience of both those who have and those who have not experienced sexual violence. So I'm just going to touch briefly on the data collection and how we achieved it. So this was a prevalence survey, not an incidence survey. So the survey did not collect, an exhaustive list of details on each individual experience that someone had undergone in their lifetime. This was a national representative sample that was used to go and collect this data. And what we mean by that is it was a mix of ages and sex all across Ireland who were selected to engage with this survey. This was an individual-based survey, so people were asked directly, and it was people who were aged 18 and over who were asked to engage on this survey. We collected it in 3 modes or 3 approaches. So we collected the data online using a secure web portal, or using self-completion on a tablet, which was facilitated by an interviewer, but where the interviewer was not present. And finally, we collected some observations on a paper survey as well. The common thread that wove these 3 together was self-completion, allowing the respondent to generate their own safe and secure environment to go and share their experiences with the CSO. So in all, we received about 4,500 responses to the survey. So just touching on some of the concepts in the sexual violence survey, and just be aware that the data we've collected and we'll be talking about, it was gathered on the basis of consent. So we ask people whether or not they experience certain behaviours with their consent or without their consent. The age of consent in Ireland is 17, and this is our cut-off point between adult experiences and childhood experiences. You may also note in the publication that we use the terminology non-consensual or unwanted. And the reason for the difference in terms is for childhood experiences we use the term unwanted because consent is not appropriate as they are under the age of consent. childhood sexual violence includes a different range of experiences than those for adulthood. So childhood sexual violence experience includes non-contact experiences as well. And just again to reiterate this point, this survey was asked of adults, and it asked adults to reflect back on their childhood. So it does not provide insights on the current levels of child sexual violence in Ireland. So I just want to touch briefly on the sexual violence definition. So the definition we used was based on national and international research on this area. And just to be aware, violence is often associated with the use of force, but it can mean having a marked or powerful effect on someone as well. So looking at the definition of lifetime sexual violence, it's whether you experienced sexual violence as an adult or as a child, or both as an adult and as a child. And the range of experiences that are included within the definition of sexual violence as an adult includes non-consensual sexual touching, where your breasts or genitals were touched without your consent, or you were made to touch someone else's breasts or genitals without your consent. It includes non-consensual attempted sexual intercourse and non-consensual sexual intercourse. It also includes any other non-specified sexual contact that happened without your consent. For sexual violence experienced as a child, it includes unwanted sexual touching, unwanted attempted sexual intercourse, unwanted sexual intercourse, other not specified sexual contact, and unwanted non-contact experiences as well. And just to outline what they might include, it's things like where someone showed you pornography where you did not want to see it when you were under the age of consent, whether someone masturbated in front of you or made you pose for sexually suggestive photographs or videos. And you can find more information on the definitions within the background notes and supporting documentation to all of our publications. And just so you're aware, this is material that we have published already from the Sexual Violence Survey. We have our methodology seminar available on YouTube, and we have our 3 publications and the links there for them on the slide for you. So just to set the context and just to remind you from the main results, the kind of landscape as it comes to sexual violence in Ireland. So what we see here is 26% of adults have experienced sexual violence as an adult. 29% of adults in Ireland have experienced sexual violence as a child. And 40% of adults in Ireland have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And there are clear age and sex differences on this. And just to outline the sex differences on the basis of the prevalence of sexual violence, what we can see here is 12% of males aged 18 and over have experienced sexual violence as an adult, compared with 39% of females who've experienced sexual violence as an adult. These sex differences appear when we're looking at childhood experiences as well, where 22% of men in Ireland have experienced sexual violence as a child, compared with 36% of women. And looking at sexual violence in their lifetime, we can see 28% of men have experienced this, compared with 52% of women. So that's the context in which we're talking about the disclosure of these experiences. So some of the key themes from this publication I've summarised here, but just to outline as well, we've provided lifetime sexual violence experiences broken down by socio-demographic characteristics in this publication as well in chapter 3. And you can take a look at that, but we're going to focus in this presentation on the disclosure related variables. So we can see different patterns for disclosure for men and women in this publication. Disclosure rates for men and women who experience sexual violence as an adult is similar, with 41% of men who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult disclosing to someone, compared with 44% of women. But when we look at sexual violence experienced as a child, 25% of men have disclosed to someone, compared with 47% of women. And you can also see some of these sex differences when we look at the reasons for disclosing or not disclosing as well. Most people are likely to disclose less than 6 months after the experience, but who they disclose to first differs as to whether it's an adult or childhood experience. So looking at those who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult and disclosed, they were most likely to disclose less than 6 months after the experience, with 67% of adults disclosing within that time frame. The equivalent rate for those who'd experienced sexual violence as a childhood was 46%, so that was the most frequently selected time period. For those who had experienced sexual violence as an adult and disclosed, they were most likely to disclose to a friend, with 56% of adults doing this. Whereas for those who had experienced sexual violence as a child, they were most likely to tell a family member, with 45% of people who had disclosed noting this. Few people disclosed to the police about their experience. Over 1 in 10 adults, or 12% of those who'd experienced sexual violence as a child and disclosed to the police. And 5% of adults who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult and disclosed to the police. And we'll talk in the following slides about some of the reasons why people do and don't disclose to the police. Most people do not use a service, and by service what we mean here is whether they went to a doctor or a medical person, whether they went to use a social work support, or whether they engaged with counselling or psychological supports. About 8 in 10 adults do not use a service. So that's 79% of people who had experienced sexual violence as an adult, and 81% of those who had experienced sexual violence as a child. So just looking and I suppose reframing ourselves again, so we're going to talk now about disclosure rates for people who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult, and that's 26% of the adult population in Ireland have experienced this. So what we can see here, as I've outlined earlier, is we can see similar rates for both male and female for the disclosure of sexual violence experienced as an adult. Just to be aware that when people had experienced multiple experiences of sexual violence as an adult, we don't ask in the survey which particular experience it was, whether it was unwanted sexual touching or whether it was non-consensual sexual intercourse. So it's whether or not they'd experienced sexual violence as an adult, and we ask them whether they disclose at least one experience of sexual violence. So just looking at the reasons why people did disclose sexual violence that they'd experienced as an adult. So 29% of people who had experienced sexual violence as an adult and disclosed to someone, they identified that they wanted to get help for themselves. 16% of people who had disclosed an experience of sexual violence as an adult noted that they were afraid that the perpetrator might do it again. And 9% of people wanted the perpetrator to be punished. Just to be aware that when people were selecting reasons, they could select all that applied to their relevant experience. So in this, we can see that 46% of people identified that there was another reason outside of those that are listed above. Only 1% of adults who had experienced sexual violence as an adult and disclosed noted that it was media coverage, so whether or not there were any news stories about sexual violence or newspaper articles or other movements that identified sexual violence as an issue. Also, as part of the survey, we can't ascribe the high level of people who identified another reason for their disclosure of sexual violence because of the sensitivities of the survey, and we couldn't include a free text field. But it's an area of research that we'll be looking at for when we repeat the survey in 10 years' time. So just looking at, I suppose, those who had identified that they wanted to get help for themselves as a reason for why they disclosed the experience of sexual violence as an adult, and just looking at a breakdown by age. What we can see here is 40% of those aged 18 to 24 who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult and disclosed noted that this was a reason as to why they disclosed. Whereas only 19% of people aged 55 to 64 who had disclosed and experienced sexual violence as an adult had identified that they'd wanted to get help for themselves. So we can see some interesting differences between age and sex for some of the reasons that are selected as we go through this publication. So just looking at the reasons why someone did not disclose sexual violence that was experienced as an adult. So 48% of adults thought that what happened wasn't serious enough to disclose. So we can see a range of reasons here, and again, people could select all that applied to their own experience. A range of reasons here, and we can see 31% of people noted that they'd felt ashamed or embarrassed to disclose to someone. 20% of people noted that they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs when it happened, and this is the reason why they didn't disclose the sexual violence to someone. Interestingly, some of the lower rates was 4% of people who didn't want to go to court, and that was the reason why they didn't disclose to someone. And only 5% noted that they didn't want the perpetrator to be punished, and that's the reason why they didn't disclose to anyone. Just looking at that breakdown of the most frequently selected reasons for not disclosing sexual violence that was experienced as an adult. And I'm just looking here at the differences between sex for the top 3 reasons. So what we can see here is that for both men and women who had experienced sexual violence as an adult and did not disclose that experience to anyone, you can see that 47% and 48% of men and women respectively noted that they thought what happened wasn't serious enough. But we can see greater differences in sex looking at the following reasons. So where people felt ashamed or embarrassed, with 15% of men who had experienced sexual violence as an adult and did not disclose identified this as a reason that they didn't disclose, whereas 36% of females did identify this. 14% of men who had experienced sexual violence as an adult and did not disclose identified that they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs when it happened, compared with a higher rate of 22% for women. Just looking at how long it took to disclose an experience of sexual violence as an adult. So for those who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult and did disclose, 67% of them disclosed less than 6 months after the experience. The next most frequent time period after that was more than 5 years. So people were most likely to tell someone within 6 months of the experience, or they were more likely to hold on to it until more than 5 years later. Looking at who they disclosed to first, what we can see is 56% of adults who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult and disclosed, they told a friend. 15% of people had told a partner or a family member. Now we're just going to take a look at the disclosure for sexual violence as a child, and just to set the scene again, 29% of adults in Ireland have experienced sexual violence as a child. So looking at this, we can see a clear difference in sex for those who had disclosed sexual violence experienced as a child. So 25% of men had experienced sexual violence as a child and disclosed to someone, compared to 47% of females. Looking at the reasons why people disclosed sexual violence experienced as a child, what we can see here is somewhat similar to the reasons for disclosing sexual violence as an adult, where most people identified that they wanted to get help for themselves, or that they were afraid the perpetrator might do it again. We can also see quite a higher rate for the other reason, and again this is something we'll be taking a look at when we're repeating this survey in 10 years' time. We can see again quite a low selection rate for media coverage, with 2% of people who had experienced sexual violence as a child and disclosed identifying this as a reason as to why they disclosed. Just looking at the reasons for why people did not disclose sexual violence which was experienced as a child. And again, we're seeing similar patterns. Most people, 38%, thought that what happened wasn't serious enough, and this was the reason why they didn't disclose. However, it is far lower than the selection rate for those who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult. 29% of people noted that they felt ashamed or embarrassed, and that's the reason why they didn't disclose, and 15% were afraid of their family's reaction. Just looking at the most frequently selected reasons for not disclosing sexual violence experienced as a child, I'm looking at broken down by sex. We can again see some clear sex differences in terms of the reasons. So 42% of men who had experienced sexual violence as a child and did not disclose identified that they thought what happened wasn't serious enough, compared with 34% of females. Females were far more likely to identify that they had felt ashamed or embarrassed as a reason why they didn't disclose sexual violence experienced as a child, compared with 19% of men. 19% of females identified that they were afraid of their family's reaction, compared with only 11% of males. Just looking at how long it took to disclose an experience of child sexual violence. So 46% of people who did disclose an experience of sexual violence as a child shared their experience in less than 6 months following that experience. This is less than the disclosure rate for people who had experienced sexual violence as an adult, which was 67%, as we saw in a previous slide. If people did not disclose their experience in less than 6 months, they were most likely to retain it until more than 5 years after the experience before they would share. Just looking at the first person the person who had experienced sexual violence as a child disclosed to, what we can see here is a different pattern than those who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult. And we can see 45% of people shared first to a family member, followed by 35% who'd shared first to a friend. Now we're just going to take a look at some of the results relating to disclosure to the police. And just to be aware that when we're looking at and using the terminology police, what we mean here is both An Garda Síochána, but also any other relevant policing authority. As we're aware that people may have been born in different countries and moved here, and we don't ask within the survey where, in terms of the geographic location, the experience occurred. So looking at people who had disclosed sexual violence to someone and whether they disclosed as well to the police, what we can see here is 5% of adults who had disclosed sexual violence experienced as an adult also disclosed to the police. 12% of people who'd experienced sexual violence as a child and disclosed, they also disclosed to the police. And there are some sex differences looking at this as well. So we can see 4% of men who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult and did disclosed to the police, compared to 6% of females. And 8% of men who had experienced sexual violence as a child and disclosed to someone disclosed to the police, compared to 13% of females. Just looking at some of the reasons why someone did not disclose to the police and experience the sexual violence as an adult. So just to remind you again, these are people who did disclose to someone but did not disclose to the police. So almost 6 in 10 thought that what happened wasn't serious enough. So 59% of people who disclosed to other people but not to the police felt that it wasn't serious enough. 32% of people felt ashamed or embarrassed to go to the police, and then 25% thought that the police wouldn't have been able to help, or that they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs when it happened. These were reasons why they didn't disclose to the police. Looking at the reasons why people did not disclose to the police and they had experienced sexual violence as a child, we can see that 41% of people thought that what happened wasn't serious enough. 28% of people who had disclosed to others but not to the police had felt ashamed or embarrassed, and that was the reason they identified that they didn't share with the police. And 16% of people thought that the police would not have been able to help. So now we're just going to take a look at whether or not people used services. So looking at what we mean by services, just to remind you again, it's whether someone used a medical service, or like went to a doctor or any other medical professional, whether they used social work support, or whether they used counselling or psychological services. So most people did not use a service. So 79% of those who experienced sexual violence as an adult didn't use a service, and 81% of people who experienced sexual violence as a child did not use a service. But for those who did use a service, or for those who had these experiences, these are the range of services that they did use. So 3% of people who had experienced sexual violence as an adult used a medical service, compared to 2% of those who had experienced sexual violence as a child. 1% had experienced either sexual violence as an adult or sexual violence as a child, engaged with social work support, and then quite similar rates for the use of a support service. So this is whether they use counselling or psychological support services. So 7% of those who experienced sexual violence as an adult used this type of service, compared to 8% of those who experienced sexual violence as a child. Because of the low rates of the use of a service, we will not be able to provide kind of detailed breakdown of whether or not they found each service helpful. However, we can provide this for the support service. So again, just reminding you, for support services, that's for counselling or psychological supports. So the vast majority of people who had experienced sexual violence as an adult or as a child and who would use a support service, they did find it helpful. 85% of people who'd experienced sexual violence as an adult found it helpful, and 83% of people who'd experienced sexual violence as a child found it helpful. Just looking at the reasons as to why people did not use a service for those who had experienced sexual violence as an adult. And we're seeing similar patterns again, where 6 in 10 people thought that what happened wasn't serious enough to actually use a service. 21% of people felt ashamed or embarrassed to use the service, and 15% of people noted that they were under the influence of alcohol or drugs when it happened, and this is the reason why they didn't engage with the service. Just looking at, I suppose, those reasons as well for not using a service for those who'd experienced sexual violence as a child. And again, we're seeing similar rates of what they thought what happened wasn't serious enough, with 43% of people identifying this. 22% of people identified that they'd felt ashamed or embarrassed to go and use the service. And 13% of people weren't sure what service to turn to. So that's just a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the key areas within the publication. So I'm just going to touch on now some of the upcoming publications that are going to come from the survey. So the next publication that's going to be published will be on sexual harassment. That'll be published in September, and this will include information on sexual harassment that occurred in the last 12 months, and it's going to provide information on the type of experience, the frequency of that experience in the last 12 months, the sex of the perpetrator, whether the harassment was disclosed or not. It'll also contain information on stalking, where someone felt they were at risk of sexual violence as well. The next publication after that, and the final publication from the survey, will be looking at attitudes to sexual violence. This will be published in October, and this is going to contain information based on responses from those who did not disclose sexual harassment or violence in the survey. So it will contain information on public opinion on some so-called rape myths, and it'll also look at the perception of the frequency of sexual violence in the community. So just to sum up, I'd just like to thank again once more all of the respondents who engaged with the survey, and it was quite a sensitive survey, so thanks again to everyone who contributed. There's been real team effort across the CSO and across the wider system as well, particularly from the Department of Justice, who have funded this research. And we've also had really strong support from the NGO support service community throughout this, and we really couldn't have achieved it without their help. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. You can see my contact details here. Contact me on svs@cso.ie or directly at helen.mcgrath@cso.ie. So I'd like to thank you for your attention.